All right, so you're good to start. We'll jump in.
Okay, Bridget, it's great to be here. It's really, your podcast is just, I mean, this is very thrilling for me and very exciting. And my daughter's jealous, and that's always fun
Oh,
when I'm getting to
fantastic.
talk to you. And thank you for bringing so much to the world.
Oh,
And, I write a lot in my book about finding help and working with an oracle and working and finding a way to be in conversation with the other side. I think the work you do is invaluable. So thank you so much.
oh, that's very sweet. I really appreciate that, Perdita, very much. Um, I am so looking forward to chatting with you because I have been reading through your book. I absolutely loved it. I think the stories that you tell in there are so like a soft, gentle voice just guiding you along the way. It's absolutely beautiful. And of course, you talk a lot about how we can connect in with the other side, the other world, the other realm with spirits, people who've passed, and so on. And I know our community will be super excited to hear more about that. But first, tell me a little bit about your journey, because you've had multiple experiences as I've learned through the book. But what has led you to this place where you're connecting in with the other side?
Well, my first agent, she was just about to retire when I sent her the first edition of this book. And the first thing she wrote back to me was, "My God, I didn't realize what a spooky little kid you were." So I guess that's where my journey begins. I think all little kids are spooky if we listen to them. Um, I had experiences, as everyone does, throughout my life that I didn't know what to do with. I grew up in a very modern American materialistic atheist family. And my father had rejected his immigrant parents' Catholicism, so much so that we didn't go to church. We weren't allowed to go to church. There wasn't any religious imagery in our house, nor was there any conversation about spirituality. It was the New York Times and cocktails before dinner. And, my mother had been raised as in a kind of nominal Anglicanism, but, you know, she had so little interest in religion and spirit that I can't even describe it. But what she loved animals, and she was a gifted gardener. In fact, when my husband first met her, he said, "Oh, you didn't tell me your mother was a witch." And I had grown up with it. So I, there are fig trees with figs on them and oranges with oranges on them. And there's a gardenia the size of a Volkswagen Bug in the dining room in full bloom. And there are little boa constrictors walking around in the kitchen. And my mother would wear an iguana walking around. My mother would wear the boa constrictor around her. I mean, she was wild. And so she raised me in a kind of feral animism that was not like something we talked about. It was the culture I grew up in. And and so I've put a lot of words to what she's done in my life. Um, and come around to that, everything was alive for her.
Mm.
Everything. She talked. I once asked her, "What's your secret to gardening?" And she just looked at me like I was crazy. And she said, "You just put everyone where they want to be."
That's sweet. Yeah.
Really in conversation with the plants
Yeah.
um but of course I had to go on my own journey, and I converted to Catholicism for literally 24 hours, as you will read in the book, because I had an abortion the next day. And then I went and got involved in Buddhism, and that didn't last. You know what I mean? Like, and my husband we're both seekers. And the thing that really began to compel our journey together was asking, what is the spiritual response to climate change?
Mm.
We were very ecologically oriented. We were hikers, we were outdoors people. We were very much in conversation with the plants and animals and very much in relationship to them. And we knew the earth was in trouble a long time ago. And we started reading about it. And we started feeling a little bit like a lot of people did in those days, like Cassandra at the gates of Troy. Like, is anybody going to pay attention? you know, what do we do? what do we do? And I began working with the dead. And I cannot explain to you, I mean, I tried to in the book. I began to collect the dead. I began to say their names. And
Mm.
I began to lie in the dark, saying litanies of the dead. And I say the dead, not my ancestors. I mean, of course, I included my grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and family members that had died, but I included teachers, pets, animals, roadkill. I included, a friend of mine in New York in a big apartment building. A woman died in his apartment building and they didn't find her body for 2 weeks. She had
Mm.
no and no family. And as they took her body out in the stretcher, the police, people in the hallway realized they didn't know her name. And it really broke my heart. And I added this woman to my litany for all those people who died alone.
Mm.
I pray with her every day. I still don't know her name, but she's a powerful person with me on the other side.
Mm.
And so I began collecting the dead, and they really started showing up. And they started letting me know they wanted to collaborate with me in a lot of the book is about all of those collaborations. But finally, and now I work with people. What I teach people is incredibly simple, and I'll teach it right now. You don't have to come take a workshop with me. The dead are real, and they want to play with you. They want to collaborate with you. All the dead who've ever been are there. They're the dirt beneath your feet. And they want to bear you up and they want to help you grow.
Mm.
And that's a little bit like saying it's easy to make bread. Take water, take flour, mix them together, put it in the oven, and that's bread. So we've forgotten a lot of the old lore about working with the dead. And I've been really interested in collecting it and recovering it. So
Mm.
that's a sort of summary of where I am right now.
Mm. Beautiful. And one thing I really appreciated in your story, your life, is actually almost as if after the passing of your father is when you could really heal and nurture that relationship. And it was such a dynamic shift. Can you speak a little bit into this journey?
Sure. I always say I'm not scared of any of the dead. I really am not. I'm not, sometimes the dead scare us trying to get our attention, and we're not very good at listening anymore. I think one of the reasons I love tarot so much is it's a way of beginning to tap into our intuitive and imaginative powers. So we listen to the other side better, right? It's a real training for us in doing that. But because we don't listen, the dead can be scary when they show up, but they never want to hurt us. And I really believe that with my whole soul and being. I am terrified of the living. The living scare the bejesus out of me. Put me in a haunted house, but don't put me in a boardroom on Wall Street. And I mean it. Living hurt each other every day. And we
Mm.
hurt each other because we don't know how to see with the eyes of the dead. And my father is someone who I had a very fraught relationship with. The book begins with him cutting me out of his will. The classic, and it's hard to cut your kids out of your will. In order to do it, you have to use really aggressive and violent language.
Mm.
And it feels really violent. And it wasn't sort of like I expected what was mine or wanted some money or some inheritance. What I wanted was love, of course.
Mm.
And I felt like when he died, I didn't get it. But our relationships with the dead aren't over. And what I began to discover from the other side, what I've learned about the dead is when they die, their personalities are very, very much the same. And I can share one of the stories in the book about my father showing up in a room with a psychic who was working with me very much as himself and is irascible and vulgar and impatient as he always was in life. But his perspective had changed because to re-enter the land of the dead is to re-enter deep time.
Mm.
and what I call the long story of our souls from one lifetime to another. We can see the big picture. We can see, oh, that's how it all fits together. And so, when some people die, if they've lived with their blinkers on, I think there's a kind of moment of their eyes widening and going, oh, I didn't get it. Well, I want to see with the eyes of the dead while I'm still alive. I want to know how entangled my soul is with everyone's soul. I want to know my the ways in which we've all known each other before and will know each other again. But what I found with my father is he wanted to atone for his mistakes. And I often say you don't have to forgive the dead. Don't talk yourself into forgiveness. If you're mad at them, be mad at them. They can take it. They're dead. You're not going to kill them with your rage. Let it rip. Now is the moment. My husband's father died at 91 last summer, and they had kind of reconciled by the time of his death. But after he died, my husband realized it was finally safe to be angry at him.
Mm.
And so he just had to be angry for a long time. His father's picture didn't end up on our ancestor altar for a full year.
Right.
But then you can realize that you're not stuck in the past. Your relationship can go forward. My father became so generous to me. He began creating miracles in my life. It's become a joke that he is so generous financially. It just happened today. It just happened today. Like I was just feeling like a little nervous about my book payment and certain bills that were due. That moment you're trying to see, like, is this all going to fit together? And I always ask my dad about money. That's become a joke. I ask him about money because he never would give me anything. Hello, I got sent $1,400 for something I didn't even know I'd done. You know what I mean? Like, and I know it's my father's fingerprints are on it. It's his little. It's a joke. My husband and I joke that I got a better inheritance being cut out of his will than I would have. He shows up in other ways too.
Mm.
And the thing that becomes is the stories I tell my children now about their grandfather are not just the stories of how stingy he was, or difficult, or judgmental, or unhappy, or depressed, and, the 9 million crimes he committed as a white male in this culture in his life. They're the stories of what a wonderful mad pirate he is, leaving buried treasure. They're the stories of you're in the hospital and you're scared. He was a doctor. He'll show up and he'll make sure everybody stays on the team. You know what I mean? Like he's a stand-up guy from the other side.
Mm.
And it's been healing for them and healing for me. And I'm not mad at him anymore.
Mm.
But it's not because I talked myself into some spiritual gymnastics of forgiveness. It's because he said, I'm sorry. And
Mm.
he showed me he was sorry.
Mm.
And that's what the difference.
Mm. I really can connect in with this concept of at that moment of death and then into the transition of whatever the afterlife is coming back into wholeness and being at your higher self. If I can just share a personal story, my dad passed away about 10 years ago after 15 years of dementia and, 3, 4 years of being nonverbal and the final sort of few months of being very, very out of character for who he was, very ill. But then every time I dream of him after he passed, he'd always show up as very happy and healthy and vibrant. And I was like, but hang on, Dad, you meant to be sick. Like, have I got this all mixed up? But now, reading through your book, I was like, no, that's really him showing up in his whole fuller self. And I think it's a real gift to be able to connect with that part of someone of who they essentially are, especially if you have been with that loved one throughout a period of illness where they are not themselves anymore. It's a gift to have that on the other side.
I sometimes think that these dementias are, in Buddhism, they talk about the bardo realm, which is an in-between state between one lifetime and another. And some people, I think, experience the bardo realm while they're still alive.
Mm,
You know, they're in between the worlds.
yes. And it's interesting because
Not a
I
fun place.
no. Oh, yeah. It's not a fun disease. Um, but one of the gifts of that period in my life and in his life is that I started to realize that communication needed to happen on a different level. That as he moves into nonverbal and as he's approaching death, that my communication, my whole kind of being and interaction with him was already starting to shift and change, which is what I think has supported me as he's transitioned into death, to be comfortable with that, if that makes sense. Because I was having, it's interesting you're saying the Bardo, that in between period, definitely
What was
lines.
his name, Bridget?
Hugh, Hugh
Hugh.
Raper, yes.
You. I just love to, one of the things is, we've got, like in the fairy tales, people, the dead love their names to be said out loud. And so I'm bringing Hugh in and my father Matthew, and, we can bring them in together. Um, do you ever ask for his help with anything?
I don't, no, I don't. But as I read your book, I'm like, come on, Bridget, you could do this. So tell me, actually, because I know our listeners will be curious as well. Where do you start? So like you've got a loved one who's passed. How do you start to connect on this level? What does it look like?
I always say you can't go too slow. Go at your own speed. Okay. I've been doing this for 35 years. No one, and I didn't have any program or system. I just felt my way into it at my own speed. So please go slowly. Also, stay small.
Mm.
Everything in our culture tells us to be big. Just go small. Maybe, maybe the first thing you're going to ask the dead for help with is getting a human being on the phone when you have a phone call to make, right? Like, can we solve this problem today? Some muckety muck with my health insurance. Don't we all go through that, right? They'd canceled it. Everything was paid. I was like, how did you cancel my health insurance? And it's this big kerfuffle, and I can't get the right person on the phone. And I stopped and I said, who can help me with this? My father was a doctor and he had a secretary. And this woman was the single secretary for a whole office of doctors. And she used to babysit me. I would sit there at her feet coloring on prescription pads. You know what I mean? Like she was somebody who was doing 20 million things at once with 20 million hands. I said, Ruth Nelson, solve it. And I got an email saying it was reinstated. You know what I mean? Like it's that fast. Now,
Mm.
sometimes there's a tendency to ignore that and say, well, that's not a miracle, but it is. And what we want to do is claim it. So one of the things we want to do is we want to build our faith slowly. Ask for help. It's so hard in our culture to ask for help. We think we have to do everything by ourselves, and we feel so lonely and so overwhelmed and so stressed. I was working with a group of young mothers today, and I said, you're not alone. And the culture has made you terribly isolated and alone.
Mm.
Purpose. But you have legions of the dead waiting to come and help you. And you can call on them for help with everything. And this is the old lore. In fact, one of the things I'm fascinated by in feminist history is Max Dashu has documented that the priests tried to get women to stop working with the dead in order to be more obedient.
Mm.
They wanted them to be isolated and dependent on them. But in order to do that, they had to stop getting them to go to the graveyards and talking to the dead. So you can begin slowly. You probably have pictures of your ancestors. Make space for the dead in your home. Find a way to make space for them, a place for them to gather. It might be as simple as putting out, a candle and a bowl of water in front of a picture of some of your loved ones on the other side. Or you might go nuts like I have and have a whole room filled with pictures of the dead. And there's so many showing up. And And trust your intuition. Someone pops into your head. And for the life of you, like for reasons I couldn't understand, my French teacher, my high school French teacher, popped into my head. And the first thing I felt was like, oh gosh, I was so awful to her. I was such an awful adolescent French student. I was so snarky and mean to her. I felt bad. I wondered, like, is she still alive? And I get onto Google her name, and she had died on that day the year before.
Huh. Wow.
And suddenly I thought, oh, that's not a coincidence. She's shown up in my imagination. She wants to play. Now, do I have amends to make to her? I just need to remember her and tell you Vivian Cunha, this woman, a French teacher with no children, will be remembered by my grandchildren whenever they need help with French or Portuguese. We also spoke. But you know what I'm saying? We just remember the dead and tell their stories and collaborate with them. I begin my morning. I'm an Olympic class worrier. I worry about my children, I worry about I have too many animals. I worry about all my gazillion ancient animals. I worry about my house that's falling apart. I worry about my friends, and what's going on in their lives. I have a lot of people I love. I have a lot of worries. And then when my husband and I drink our coffee, we call in the dead. Who's going to help? Who's going to show up? Who can we bring onto the team today? We
Mm.
turn over our worries, get in the back seat of the car, and let the dead do the driving. That's how I begin my day.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. I think oftentimes people will call on angels and archangels and so on. I'm curious, are we
Explain
talking a
that to you.
similar flow?
I can explain to you why that is.
Yeah.
So before there was a god, there were gods and goddesses, right? If you go anywhere around the world, you find pantheons of gods. In fact, there's so many gods. They're not just 12 Greek gods and goddesses. They're lesser gods and gods. There's gods and goddesses everywhere. Every culture around the world has many gods. Those are just the ancestors. Those are just the ancestors from a really long time ago, whom people have been calling on for a really long time.
Mm.
But when monotheism comes along, um, and I'll shorten this, one God to rule them all, it's got to silence the voices of those ancestors.
Mm.
And the silencing of the ancestral realm, many of those gods and goddesses were part animal and part human, part plant and part human. They were very much connected to the animate everything. My daughter calls the animate everything. And so you were in conversation, not just with the gods and goddesses, you were in conversation with the trees and the water and the springs and the stones and the mountains. And so you were part of a web of belonging. But monotheism comes in and silences those voices. Now, they persist in Christianity for a long time as the cult of the saints. The saints are just the ancient pantheons kind of hanging out.
Mm.
But we see in the pivot to what we call the modern world, the great silencing of the dead. And Protestantism is going to obliterate the cult of the saints, right? It's going to be Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Poor guy, he's got so much to do and no one to help him. And it's awful being alone out there. and they turn, they don't even don't even have devotion to the Virgin Mary. It's just Jesus, right? But people can feel that they're more helpers than just God and Jesus. So they start calling them angels.
Mm.
Real angels in the scriptural texts and from people I know who've met them aren't a lot of fun. They're really intense beings of really spiritual otherness.
Mm.
They're not cozy and fun. Raina Maria Rilke said, every angel is terrifying because beauty's just the start of terror we can hardly bear. And I have not had an encounter with an angel, but I know people who have, and they describe it as like, I wasn't sure my soul was going to stay in my body.
Mm.
But guardian angels, fairy godmothers, those are your ancestors. Those are the dead. Those are your grandmothers, your aunts. Those are your mothers from past lives who still show up for you even now and keep an eye on you and love you.
Mm. Mm. Beautiful. Yes. I know you kind of touched on this at the start, which was to say, like, the dead are never really scary. And I know one of my friends is able to communicate with people who've passed, and she's had what she experienced as a frightening experience. So how do you kind of differentiate between the two?
They can be frightening when they show up. So I've had the dead show up in my bedroom. I used to have it happen a lot more often before I knew how to talk to them and tell them this was not my preferred way of communication. So I had one night, a giant guy showed up just fallen asleep. It was dark, and a giant guy walked into the room. I mean, 8 feet tall. And I screamed at the top of my lungs, like, blood curdling, holy shit scream, excuse me. And my husband like leaps up, and of course, then this giant vanishes. And he says, "What happened? What happened?" I said, "It was a giant. It was like the Hound from Game of Thrones. He was the Hound." And my husband said he was a giant hound. I said he was a giant hound, but he wasn't like the Hound. He wasn't like that. He was something else. He wants something from me. And I start researching giants, hounds, dogs, and I discover a saint, Saint Christopher. Some people may know Saint Christopher listening to the podcast because people call on him for protection in their cars. They often have Saint Christopher medals in their cars. But Saint Christopher was a giant with a dog's head. And he was famous. Remember how I said about the saints often are half animal, half human? He's a
Mhm.
saint with a dog's head. And he was famous for carrying the Christ child across a river. And because of that, he's the patron saint of carrying things, vehicles, cars. But he's a giant. And if you follow the mythology of Christopher Bach, he becomes Anubis in Egyptian mythology, who's got the head of a jackal and who ferries people across the river between the living and the dead.
Mm.
And so I became really fascinated by Christopher. And I thought, you've come up to do something with me. You scared me. I don't want you ever showing up like that again. Let's talk, okay? And you have something to about my children and my fears about their cars. Maybe that's it. Maybe there's other work we are meant to do together. And a month later, I'm in New York City at a friend's book opening, and I'm sitting next to a woman at a dinner table afterwards. We're at a big party in a restaurant, and I'm sitting next to somebody I've never met before, and we're chatting away. She asks what I do, and I'm working on a book about talking to the dead, And she says, "Oh, people actually are very forthcoming when I talk about this. Her son had died just 6 months earlier."
Mm.
So I asked her to tell me about him. And she said he was very tall. She said he was 6'10". And she said, and he worked with children. And I have pictures of him holding all these children on his shoulder. Would you like to see? And I said, yes. And she takes out a picture, and it's this giant of a man with a child on his shoulder, just like Christopher the Saint. And I
Mm.
said, what was his name? I always ask people the name of their dad. And she said, Christopher. I think he's been showed up for me.
Yeah.
And she began to weep. And I said, I'd like to work with him with your permission. And I began to work with him. And I didn't know that Christopher had shown up because just before COVID, I ran into his mother, not in New York City, but in my little tiny town. I ran into her in a bookstore. I said, Zati, it's you. What are you doing here? And she said, oh, I just moved here. We made plans to get together, and I didn't hear from her. And I reached out, and she'd been killed in an accident.
Hmm.
And I realized that she and her son had come through. Their photo is right here on my altar to work. They wanted me to remember them. They knew that I'm a memory keeper and that I would hold their memory and work with them very deeply, which I have. And but the initial encounter was terrifying.
Hmm.
A woman I know had a man show up in her bedroom with his hair on fire. She was staying at a friend's house. She screamed, bloody murder. Everyone came running in. The next night he showed up again. She said, what happened here? They did some research, and there'd been a terrible fire, and the owner of the house had died in the fire.
Hmm.
But he hadn't come to haunt her. He needed a memory keeper.
Hmm.
So she knew his name, and she began working with him. You can work with anyone. If someone terrifying shows up, first thing, tell them, I don't like this way you're showing up. Go away. But then work with them. Because the dead are going to try to get our attention. And the
Hmm.
more subtly they can get their attention. Now the dead pop into my imagination. I don't need them to pop into my room so much. My son was struggling with his mother's faith, and how crazy I am. And he was alone in the house, and our kitchen abuts this ancestor altar you see behind me. And it was a perfectly calm summer day, dead quiet, no windows open, just silence, stillness, alone in the house. He gets himself a glass of water and he turns around, and every photograph on the ancestor altar fell off onto the floor, and not a one of them broke.
Hmm.
And I said, he was so freaked out and so scared. I said, what does it mean, Mom? What does it mean? And I said, it means you got to make an ancestor altar and start working with your ancestors.
And do your daughter and your son, are they're working actively with
Oh, yes.
realm? Yeah, great.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Kids, this is people love to do this. And it's a wonderful thing to do. People want to remember the dead, and we no longer know how.
Mm.
We no longer know how to keep the dead alive.
Mm.
And when they so for instance, my I was about to go up and visit my son, and a psychic called me, and I have a lot of friends who are psychics. I wrote a book with a psychic. I adore psychics, and I'm honored to call many of them my friends. And one of them called me up, and she said, "Did your godmother's husband smoke a pipe?" And I said, "He did. In fact, it was the most notable feature about this man." And in fact, he died of bladder cancer caused by smoking that pipe back in the 1970s. And she said, he wants to work with your son. I said, really? This man who died in the 1970s wants to work with my son? She said, yes, he has plans for him. I take these kinds of transmissions very seriously. So that where is he, Rab, buried? Well, wouldn't you know, he's buried in a cemetery 10 minutes from my son's house,
Mm.
now living,
Mm.
coincidentally. So I go up to visit my son. I say, would you mind if we go to the cemetery to try to find Rab? And he said, no, well, that's fine. That's a nice place to walk. He's very open. We get to the cemetery, and it's one of the biggest cemeteries I've ever been in. And there's no grave finder, no, and we're never going to find it. It's miles, you know. We could be reading names forever. I said, we can give up. We know we're here. We came here. He wants to help you. That's great. And so we walk out to leave and head back to the car. And my son steps on a grave and looks down and said, Mom, Rab Brooks, he's right here. And he's helped my son. And then I called his daughter to tell her and took a picture of his grave and said, he's working with my son. Your father's still here. Your
Hmm.
father died in 1970, is still helping people.
Mm. It's profound. Yeah. How did she respond to that? I'm sure that would be an
People
absolute gift.
cry. I mean, I
Yes.
mean, I mean, what if we don't know what to do when people die? Like people when children die.
Mm.
I always say some lives are very short, but we don't understand the long story of our soul. And sometimes souls, and I want to talk about souls, souls make appointments with our soul, knowing they may not be able to stick around for a long time.
Mm,
So maybe they can only come for 3 months and then you're going to miscarry. But that soul loves you and wanted to make an appointment with you. And so that small life is a mighty soul who has profound work to do with you. And what if we knew that? What
mm,
if we knew that every soul who showed up was mighty?
mm, mm. And that's so much about this kind of interconnection and interplay between the dead and the living, right? And that's what I appreciated in your book is actually so much, there was so much crossover in the experience of living and then the experience of dying or being dead, and how they teach us so much about both realms. Like they are coexisting. They have to. It's not
I've,
one and
I've
the
been on
other.
I've been on a Mark Twain kick, which is a very long story, but I feel like he's one of the great patron saints of reincarnation, and he had a lot to say about it in a very homespun American way. And he said the smartest people I know are the dead. He said, so the way I look at it, we all ought to start dead and move on from there. Of that, like we do start dead. We
Mm,
start with eons of lifetimes behind us. And if we knew how to claim them and help children claim those past lives, that would be powerful.
mm, yes. Yeah. As a tarot reader and teacher myself, I'm very curious about if and how you bring tarot cards into your connections with the dead.
Well, my daughter is a very skilled tarot reader, and she began by listening to your podcast. So we have
Well taught.
family, we have family tarot nights, and our family has always been interested in, I call them oracles. And I always tell people, I think it's really important to find out what oracular method works for you. So, for instance, my husband has been doing the I Ching for 50 years. He's a very adept master of the I Ching. It really speaks to him. I hear about the wise man and his, castle, and I think the I Ching does not speak to me. It's not my method. It really works for my husband. My personal oracular method has been the natural world, the trees, the birds, the animals, the flowers. I really, and the moon. I've worked a lot with Ted Andrews' Animal Speak for years, and I get a lot of communication from the animal world. But my communications became much more sophisticated and nuanced after I studied tarot.
Mm,
Like tarot teaches you how to be in conversation with the natural world, I think.
mm, mm,
Or some people use the runes. That's another way, right? There's so many of these different methods. Um, my book got published on Tuesday, so of course I sat down with my daughter. We did a whole reading and a whole spread just to talk about it. It's a way that the dead can come through to us and guide us, right? What is your experience as a tarot reader with the dead?
well, I'll touch on that in just a sec, but I've just realized something. The day that your book has come out is the same day that our re-release of Everyday Tarot has come out. It's the paperback. So we've got a sharing a book birthday together. That's really sweet.
And see, we are already wound together in ways we don't know.
Yes.
And one of the things I tell people in my book, so here's the thing. Anybody who likes my book has to go out and get Everyday Tarot, because I really do think you have to know how to work with an oracle.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Essential art, I think.
it's like similar to what you were saying earlier. What I love about tarot and like all of these different channels is that, as you said, it is a way to start opening and accessing your intuition and your connection with a higher power or the energy, whatever you want to call it. And it's funny because with tarot, I often say like, oh, people think you've got to be psychic or intuitive in order to read tarot, but I think it's the other way around. Tarot helps you become more intuitive.
I agree. So I agree. And also, you want to know the funniest thing? The two most powerful psychics I know, and I wrote a book with this one woman, and she had to train herself to tell the living and the dead apart. She's that powerful a psychic. And
Hmm.
both of these psychics use tarot cards as props. They don't
Yes.
actually read the tarot. They I've watched them. They're not reading tarot. They can't teach. They throw the cards around, and every now and then they'll grab one and they'll say something. But you could have handed them a pack of playing cards. You could have handed them a pack of index cards. And I swear they could have done it because they're psychic.
Mm. Mm. Yes.
But for the rest of us, we can develop our psychic abilities, I think. And that's what I've experienced and seen in people.
Yeah, and I think what helps is it's is tangible thing. It's like, well, there's a picture that says this. That's why I'm having this thought or feeling. And it gives us a bit more kind of stability in this 3D world to go, oh, well, that's why I'm having this feeling, even though maybe it's actually happening because it's on an intuitive level, you know?
Right. And it's also, imagination, which is, I mean, tarot really involves both intuition and imagination, right? I mean, because it's about connection and the interconnection of the cards, of seeing the story the cards are telling. And the psychics I know say that, novelists and poets are psychic.
Mm.
Imagination is psychism.
Mm.
Yes, it might just be your imagination, but your imagination is not just your imagination. Your imagination is often your precognition. Precognition is your ability to see the future. And I began to realize that I would write these stories when I was a teenager, and I became very frightened because it would come true.
Mm.
And what I didn't realize was that I was having, prophetic experiences. So it seemed like just my imagination. And in fact, I was sending myself messages from the future.
Mm. Yeah, it's so powerful. But yes, coming back to how do I use tarot with connecting with the dead people? I straight up I don't. I haven't connected it, but I bet there's so many ways that you could, because even even if you want to kind of bring this stuff into the tangible real world, even just to say, all right, I'm going to connect with my dad. I bring in Hugh, and if I don't yet feel confident in having a conversation or hearing it, maybe I could start to use cards to go, all right, Dad, what message have you got for me today?
That's it. That's it. Because what we're doing, the dead aren't a vending machine. It's not like we're saying, like, do this, and then they do it, and we say, good, thank you. We're having a conversation. And the dead have more perspective than we do, right? So you asked your father for help with something, right? Or, I asked my grandmother for help from something, and we start to have a conversation. But that tarot card can be the medium for the
Mm.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's simple and powerful. I love it.
I do too. That's what I do.
Yeah.
I also do I'm making right now, I don't think they'll be listening, so it's okay, but my nieces and nephews, I'm making an oracle deck of an ancestral oracle with prayers and what all the different ancestors are the patron saint of, and with their photos. It's going to be their Christmas present.
I love it. How special. That's
Yeah,
amazing.
it's really fun. We in one of my classes we do that. We create our own ancestral oracles, and you think about, like, well, what is your grandmother, the patron saint of, your, or my unremarkable grandmother who just had 6 children and 24 grandchildren she kept alive during the Depression. She can help you do
Amazing.
anything.
Yeah. Yeah. So powerful. Um, so I mean, I could chat with you forever. And actually, you know what? I think what's beautiful, even just this conversation, is so reflective of the tone and the voice that you have in your book. Because I know that as I was reading, I felt like I was sitting over a hot cup of tea with you, and I love seeing that reflected in our conversation here today. So, just for those who are listening, I just think if you are tuning in and resonating in any way, just know that this is that flow that you'll find in the book of Take Back the Magic. So tell me, where can people get this book? I know it's always like where books are sold, right?
It's where where books are sold. And of course, the easiest place to get it is the great monster Amazon. But you go to your independent bookstore if you have one. There is a bookstore called the Golden Notebook in Woodstock, New York, and you can order your book there. That's they're gonna supply all my books. I'll even sign it for you if you want. They'll send you a signed copy. But you can order the book. It's available everywhere. And my beloved editor said to me, she said, I just hope we can get this book in Target. So I hope someday you can buy the book in Target. That's
Yes.
our goal.
Yes. Yeah. I had a similar goal. I was like, I wanted my book or my deck into Urban Outfitters. I was like, that
Oh,
is Tarot in the mainstream. Thank you. And we got there. It was great.
did you get there?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. Okay. So Target on the Target. I hope you can buy it at Target, but until then, buy it wherever you'd like. And you can
Yeah.
find out more about my workshops and my work at takebackthemagic.com.
Oh, fantastic. So, yes, tell me a little bit about these workshops that you hold. What do you offer in
Yeah.
those?
Well, like I said, the dead are real and you can collaborate with them, make some bread. But, if you really want to learn how to make some croissant or some, it's like get your sourdough starter gumming, I create groups. I offer a lot of different kinds of workshops for people in collaborating with the other side. And
Mm.
I have, introductions about how to do that. And then I have longer year-long classes about creating an ancestral oracle and working with them on a big project. I offer courses on how to kind of work with what I call the long story of our own souls and really begin to claim the wisdom from our other lives. You get a lot of cornucopia, but they're all about the dead are real. And then I offer monthly conversations for just anyone to come and talk about their experiences, because one of the things is we're all having these experiences. And I want to change the belief sphere of our intuition. And we do that best in conversations, telling stories together.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love it. And is that all online or in person or a bit of both?
I do it, COVID has been the great online moment, right? So I'm offering a ton of stuff online. I'm just beginning to offer stuff in person again. So
Mm.
I'm doing a 3-day extravaganza in Woodstock, New York. If you're around Woodstock, the whole town, our great hippie mecca, shuts down. Everyone gets dressed up in costume, and it will be 3 days of peace, magic, and the dead. So
It's magic in the dead. Yeah, that sounds great.
if you're around, come and play with me. They're going to be wild folks are coming into town, musicians, artists. We're gonna,
Yeah, and they could
throw
be
up a great
alive.
night.
They might be dead. Not quite sure.
We're gonna have a lot of psychics are gonna be there.
It sounds wonderful. And what are you working on, say, into next year? What's kind of coming down the pipeline in the next 6 to 12 months?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm actually finishing up my next book, which is called The Body of My Mother. And it's about looking at the mother before patriarchy, the mother within patriarchy, and imagining the mother beyond patriarchy. And here's when I talk about the mother, what would it be like if everyone imagined themselves, remembered that we'd all been each other's mothers in past lives,
Mm.
male and female, young and old, whatever our genders, we have all been each other's mothers. And what does it mean to remember that? What does it mean to remember that every being we meet has been our mother, and
Mm.
we have been the mother of every being we meet? So it's about a kind of, I call it a radical erotic animism. Anyway, it's called The Body of My Mother, Recovering the Love at the Heart of the World.
Wow, that's amazing. Fantastic. When does that come out? Do you have a
Well,
publication date?
I haven't even given the proposals just
Oh,
done,
okay.
and I'm sending it next week to my agent to read. And but if you want to subscribe to my Substack, you can read the whole proposal and tell me what you think about it.
Oh, wow. So you're doing that's brave. That's good.
I do better when I'm just out there. You know what I mean? And people are so wonderful. And it's really helpful to connect to an audience and write with people. And
Mm.
I really like the collaborative experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic.
Of course
Oh,
you go.
mm,
So yeah, I'm working on that book. And what I really, I say, the world will be healed when 15-year-old boys want to be mothers again.
hmm.
I have
Interesting.
one, by the way. I have a son. I have that son, so I'm really proud of him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's definitely that would be a healing, very healing path. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Perdita, I've so enjoyed talking with you. I just, your work is amazing. And thank you for giving me faith in communicating with dead people. Because I'll just, I do sometimes say a little bit tongue in cheek that you don't have to speak to dead people to read tarot. But now I see that it's actually a lot easier.
It's just fun. I mean,
Yes.
tarot's a great way to work with the dead, right? It's just they're coming through. They love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. And you make it so easy and simple and normal, which is beautiful. So,
Well, that's what you say. That's what you do too, right? This is an everyday. This changes our everyday lives. It's ordinary magic. And it's the ordinary magic, the day-to-dayness that transforms the world.
beautiful. Oh, what a great way to end. Thank you so much. I appreciate you very, very much.
I appreciate you. I wish we could just have a cup of tea and hug for a while.
Yes. Yep. Fantastic. Well, thank you. Hey, if you loved this video, then make sure you check out this next video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you next time.